Mikalah, and I'm the site supervisor at the Sibley Historic Site. We originally had this tea planned for March, and that didn't happen. So we're excited to do it now virtually. I hope you all enjoyed the tea set you were sent. Maybe you brewed it for this presentation, and I hope you're enjoying it. With me, we have Anne Essling, who put together this presentation, and we are going to do a skit for you. And our other, who else joined us is Ruth Stryker-Gordon, who worked at the U of M in the School of Public Health, and she knew the suffragette we are talking about. So she's joining us to give some firsthand account, which is pretty exciting. First, before we do our presentation, we were able to join in with TPT this year to do a short production on Minnesota and our fight for suffrage. So I think we got about 14 people here. People might join in, but I think we can start with this video. So I'm gonna share my screen here, and I'm gonna mute you, Anne and Ruth, so in case we drop something, we don't hear it during the video here. All right. Let's see. Share. All right, and here we go.
In Minnesota, women have long supported reform movements that sought equality, including the right to vote. Often their efforts were met with rejection, but a sign of hope emerged in 1875, when women were granted voting rights in school board elections. And a few years later, the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association formed in Hastings. They advocated, organized marches, and wrote petitions. The Daughters of the American Revolution acquired, restored, and made the Sibley House in Mendota one of Minnesota's first historic sites. A momentous demonstration occurred in 1914 when Clara Yulin organized a parade of more than 2,000 supporters in Minneapolis. But they were not done yet. On August 18, 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Minnesota women became the first ever in the nation to vote under the 19th Amendment when South St. Paul women lined up to vote for the water bond referendum. It was a glorious victory for many women in Minnesota, but not every woman. Though white women began to vote, discriminatory policies kept men and women of color out of the polls for decades. In 1924, Native Americans were granted citizenship. But in Minnesota, many were still barred from voting until a new amendment in 1960 protected their voting rights. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act reduced barriers for all citizens. Since then, women have run for and served in political offices. In South St. Paul, women held the position of mayor for 28 years. A century after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the nation continues striving towards equality.
This has been a TPT Partnerships co-production.
All right. So that was our video we did. It's very fun to be a part of that and join in with the research and help put it together. So we enjoyed that, and you can see it on hopefully TPT on air at some point. All right, Anne, you're unmuted, are you?
I believe so. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yes, yes. Okay. Gotta click a couple more buttons here before I share our PowerPoint so you're able to see both of us while we do this screen share. All right. So Ruth, we will stop your video now so you can watch our presentation. Oh, I stopped my video. Oops. Here we go. There we go. Okay. There we go. Do you see it from the beginning? There we go. All right. So in 1899, Sara Colvin became a member of the Minnesota Daughters of the American Revolution. Today, Sara Colvin's name is on the memorial to women's suffragists at our state capitol. How did a Minnesota DAR, who was a doctor's wife, become a suffragist who participated in the pickets, arrests, and hunger strikes in Washington, D.C. that awakened public awareness, leading to the 19th Amendment being passed and ratified? The 19th Amendment reads, "The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." The 19th Amendment passed in Congress on June 4th, 1919. Minnesota approved the amendment on September 8th, 1919. On August 18th, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment, giving it the 2/3 majority needed for state ratification to make it law of the land. On August 27th, 1920, at 6 a.m., Miss Margaret Newberg of South St. Paul voted in her precinct and was the first woman in the United States to vote under the 19th Amendment. The National Women's Suffrage Association formed in 1869 in New York City and had such leaders as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It welcomed other suffrage organizations to become auxiliary organizations. In Minnesota, their leader was Clara Euland. After the 19th Amendment passed, NWSA changed its name to the League of Women Voters. The NWSA strategy was to, state by state, pass legislation to allow women to vote. By 1910, only 5 states had passed such legislation. Some had partial rights. In Minnesota, women could vote in school board elections in 1875. Alice Paul, a Pennsylvania Quaker, was in London for schooling, became active in the British women's suffrage movement. In Britain, she was arrested for her suffrage protests and went on a hunger strike. She was force-fed milk and raw eggs in a London jail. When Paul returned to the United States, she joined NWSA. She was asked to chair a committee in Washington, D.C. to lobby for the 19th Amendment be passed in the U.S. Congress. 1913. Alice Paul's first ever event was a suffrage procession on Monday, March 3rd, 1913. On the same day, Woodrow Wilson came to Washington, D.C. to assume his presidency. Police refused to control the spectators and did nothing to prevent violence against the marchers. Dozens of marchers were spit on, slapped in the face, pelted with burning cigar stubs, insulted with obscene language too vile to print or repeat. Hundreds were injured. After the procession, the participants met at the Daughters of the American Revolution Memorial Continental Hall. NWSA objected to Paul's destructive tactics. Subsequently, Paul founded the National Women's Party. The single purpose of the NWP was to obtain women's right to vote. While NWSA had been nonpartisan, the NWP opposed political candidates against suffrage and supported candidates supporting suffrage. By 1914, 5 more states allowed women to vote in national elections. Of the 10 allowing women to vote, only Illinois was east of the Mississippi. In 1915, Sara Colvin, a resident of St. Paul, Minnesota, was visiting Washington, D.C., and became aware of Alice Paul's organization. She joined and helped to organize a Minnesota branch, later becoming its president. May I present to you Miss Sara Colvin.
Miss Paul found that the suffrage movement in America had lost all power of planning for action and was content with a routine policy of introducing the suffrage amendment every time there was a new Congress, and then going back to New York and settling down to work with small groups of women who merely talked about the great reforms they would make when they had won the power of the ballot. I was born in the South, just after the Civil War. Becoming a nurse and working at Johns Hopkins Hospital was radical for a Southern woman of a certain class who was supposed to be taken care of. When nursing in Montreal, I met and married Dr. Alexander R. Colvin. I knew my Canadian husband would never understand or adapt to Southern racial mores. Consequently, we chose to move to St. Paul, Minnesota for him to set up his practice. It was after we moved to St. Paul that I became a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution.
By 1916, 9 more states gave women the right to vote. The NWP took their message to the Western states where women could vote. In Europe, the World War had been going on for 2 years. Most in the United States were against war. 1916 was an election year. Wilson was campaigning on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Wilson was against the war and women's voting rights. The NWP slogan for Wilson was, "He kept us out of suffrage." Wilson's Republican opponent, Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes, supported the suffrage amendment.
In the fall of 1916, Woodrow Wilson came to Chicago to ask the women of Illinois to vote for him. I went to Chicago to take part in a huge demonstration put on by the Women's Party and led by Alice Paul to greet Mr. Wilson as he was driven to the auditorium. We held up banners asking him why he had come to ask for votes from some women when he refused to support suffrage for all women. As soon as he was gone into the auditorium, we were suddenly attacked by a group of men who hurled themselves at us in a flying tackle, scattering us from side to side. They sat upon us, and while they did us no violence, they seized the banners and tore them to shreds. Had I known earlier what was going to happen, fear might have prevented my even attending the demonstration. But as it was, I was not the least bit afraid. Miss Paul kept us all in a little huddle until there was nothing left of our banners, and then we marched back to headquarters. On the way back, I asked Miss Paul if these demonstrations ever frightened her. She said that no physical attacks ever frightened her, but that whenever she found it impossible to get an idea across, she was badly frightened, and as she expressed it, felt terribly lonely.
The election took 3 days to count. Wilson won by only 600,000 votes. Had he lost California, which he won only narrowly, he would have lost the electoral vote.
One of the big and spectacular plays put on by Miss Paul was a trip across the country in what was known as the Women's Suffrage Special. A private train car was rented and a long and interesting itinerary mapped out, which was planned to bring a group of women from the non-suffrage states with petitions to the women in the suffrage states, asking them to come to our assistance. I joined the party in Chicago, and we went through all of the Western states where women had the vote. There were public meetings, petitions were signed, and messages were sent directly to the president. It was picturesque and very effective.
On January 9th, 1917, the petitions were presented to President Wilson. In that meeting, Wilson made it abundantly clear that he would not support suffrage, period. On January 10th, 12 NWP suffragists held the first silent vigil in front of the White House. While Congress was in session, silent vigils were held every day but Sunday until 6 p.m. On February 28th, newspaper headlines announced Germany offered Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if they would join Germany against the United States. That same day, the president who campaigned on the slogan, He kept us out of war, went to Congress requesting a declaration of war against Germany. America was now at war. NWSA put their activity on hold, but the NWP continued its work in silent vigils in front of the White House. In June, the first arrests of the NWP protesters occurred. The picketing went on, and the arrests went on. In prison, Alice Paul began hunger striking.
Dr. Colvin, my husband, was now a doctor in the military, stationed at Fort Henry in Baltimore. This is when I began picketing at the White House with the NWP. Finally, I was sentenced to 5 days in the Washington jail for picketing, during which time I hunger struck. A most unpleasant experience. I was arrested at 11 o'clock in the morning for displaying a banner before the White House and taken to the police court, from where later I was sent to the detention house. I was brought in about 5 o'clock in the afternoon and taken to a room where there were 2 or 3 empty beds. As the matron was leaving, she said, "If you have any jewelry or money with you, do not keep it, because I do not know who will be in the room with you. Sometimes we bring in drunken women who would fight you for it, and they might injure you badly." I gave her my pocketbook, and she went out and closed the door. The sound of that closing door caused me a greater sense of fear than I had ever experienced again. I was never so near panic. There was no knob on my side of the door. I could not get out. For the first time in my life, I was behind locked doors and literally in the clutches of the law. Fortunately, the prison matron sat with me until bedtime. I believe I have the distinction of being the only suffragist who was ever alone in jail. All of the others had the company of from 2 to 6 of their coworkers. My entrance into the women's part of the jail was one I shall never forget. I was escorted through the men's quarters, a huge round room with cells up to the ceiling, crowded with prisoners who stared at us and jeered as we passed through. I can think of nothing more improper than conducting women prisoners through the men's quarters. I can still often recall that row upon row of men, their eager curiosity to see who we were, and their voices as they called out to us. Well, the Washington jail was clean and sanitary as such buildings go, but it was full of rats. I minded them more than anything else. I can still hear them squealing and fighting, and the sound they made as they fell from the table to the floor and scurried away. Well, I did not eat while I was there, so I cannot say how the food was, but it did not look inviting. I have one arresting memory. An old woman, a chronic drunkard, was brought in, dirty, sick, and starved. They brought her some food, which she wolfed down. By the next evening, she looked like a human being almost, and I had a little talk with her. The one thing I have always remembered was that for her, jail was better than her life outside. As she said to me, "At least I have a bed to myself and 3 meals a day."
Previously, other suffragists were sentenced for up to 60 days for blocking traffic. Some were put in solitary confinement. The prison officials tried to establish that the suffragists were insane, preventing them from sleeping by shining lights in their eyes at night. Some were beaten, dragged, kicked, and even knocked unconscious by guards. The suffragists' inmates committed to hunger striking. Alice Paul and Rose Winslow became so weak from hunger, they were sent to the prison hospital, the psychiatric wing. There they were force-fed 3 times a day.
Now, the courts were limiting our sentences to 5 days because all of the suffragists refused to eat. And after 5 days, the lack of food begins to affect one physically. Women under longer sentences became really quite sick and had to go to the hospital. Hunger striking affects people differently. Some women went to bed and slept during the whole 5-day imprisonment. I was violently nauseated after the second day. My head ached all of the time. I was unable to sleep. I lost weight very rapidly. I had no desire for food because my sense of taste seemed to have vanished.
In 1917, 4 more states, including New York, approved voting rights for women, bringing the total to 14 out of 48. On September 30th, 1918, President Wilson finally endorsed women's suffrage. This time, the resolution narrowly passed the House, but it died in the Senate. Though Wilson had endorsed suffrage, he did nothing to help pass the amendment. In 1918, 3 more states gave women the vote, for a total of 17 states.
The day I took the train to Washington to picket and was arrested, I hadn't told Dr. Colvin what I was going to do, claiming I thought his day would be easier if he did not know what was likely to happen. When I got back to Baltimore after being arrested, after the first shock of his learning that I could possibly consider anything more important than his career, we had a full and frank discussion of the whole situation, finished the subject, and never discussed it again. It has made no difference in our lives.
In February 1919, on the eve of the vote in the Senate on the suffrage amendment, while several thousands watched, 65 NWP members, including Sara Colvin, burned Wilson in effigy in front of the White House.
In the demonstration in which we burned Woodrow Wilson in effigy, each one of us threw a small bundle of wood on the fire to keep it alive while speeches were being made. This project of ours had been well publicized by Miss Paul, so there was a huge crowd waiting for us, with many soldiers and sailors in it. These soldiers and sailors were prevented by their officers from attacking us. According to our plans, we marched 2 by 2, each of us holding a small bundle of kindling wood under her arm. I had mine under my coat so that it would not be seen by the police, who would have taken it away from me. The first 2 women carried a small urn in which they intended to light a fire. But when they stopped, the police confiscated the urn. In some way, I was too far away to see exactly how. A fire was started, and the women crept up and put their wood on it, and it continued to burn. When I strolled up, I had a policeman on either side of me, and I just was succeeded in throwing my bundle on the fire as they didn't see it. And then I was arrested. By that time, there were more than 30 of us, and we were carried off to the police station where we were kept for 1 night. They were prepared for us. In a large upper room in the police station, there were new beds, sheets, and pillowcases. And after a rather hilarious evening, we slept quite well. We were not put in cells. In the morning, the door was thrown open, and the matron appeared and called out dramatically, "Ladies, arise!" And again, with much laughter, we dressed and appeared in court. There were too many of us to be sent to the regular jail, so we went to an abandoned jail to serve our 5-day sentences. In the meantime, Congress adjourned. When that august body was not in session, no legislation could be passed, so we always stopped picketing. And so after a 24-hour fast, Miss Paul paid our fines and we were released.
On June 4th, 1919, the 19th Amendment finally received the votes necessary in the U.S. Congress to be sent to the states for ratification.
But as soon as we were released, we started on another trip across the continent in what was called the prison special. As we had all served sentences, we told our dramatic story to win President Wilson away from his indifference to the suffrage movement and to ensure the states would ratify our amendment.
From February through March, they made one last push for suffrage, bringing the stories of the inhumane prison sentences served by so many women who fought for the vote. The train traveled the nation, packed with Sara Colvin and 25 members of the NWP. When they arrived at their destination, they would don uniforms like the ones they were forced to wear at the prison workhouse. In August 1920, Tennessee's ratification made the 19th Amendment the law of the land. Miss Margaret Newberg of South St. Paul voted on August 27, 1920, at 6 a.m. in her precinct, and was the first woman in the United States to vote under the 19th Amendment. After women won the vote in 1920, Paul wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, which states, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article." It was put before Congress first in 1923. Finally, on March 22, 1972, the US Senate passed the Equal Rights Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. Today, 48 years later, the amendment has not been made law of the land. The ERA was work that continued to be done after the 1920 right to vote. And while that was a victory for many women, and we get to celebrate it today, not all women and men were able to vote after that 1920 day. Issues towards getting citizenship and discriminatory policies kept men and women of color out of the polls for decades. The 1924 Snyder Act did finally grant citizenship to Native Americans. In 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act also then gave all Asian Americans the right to become citizens, which would enable them to vote. But other discriminatory policies like poll taxes, literacy tests, and pure violence and intimidation for not even registering to vote kept many out of the polls. But in 1964, the 24th Amendment that outlawed the poll taxes. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act banned the literacy tests and gave a greater accessibility to language and translators and ramped up voting registration efforts. So as Susan B. Anthony said, failure is impossible. And ladies, our work is not yet done.
Well, now I'm back to being Anne Essling. I have to confess that I knew virtually nothing about our suffrage movement and what allowed women to vote, myself included, obviously, until 2 years ago when Ruth Stryker Gordon stood up at a Colonial Dames meeting that I was at and talked about a woman that she knew named Sara Colvin. And a whole new world was opened up to me. So I would like to introduce Ruth to have her speak of her firsthand knowledge of this woman that's changed our lives. Ruth, can you unmute, or can we see you again?
Yes, I think I was able to unmute her, but I think you have to press
You have to
start
do the
video
video.
at the bottom of your screen.
There
There we
she
go.
is.
There you are.
Okay. Well, I knew Sara Colvin as a third grandmother and her husband, Dr. Colvin, as a third grandparent. It was because my grandparents lived not far from them, close to the river drive. And my father used to just love to go with Dr. Colvin in his horse and buggy on house calls. A great treat for him. And I remember his talking about that. Anyway, the friendship has went on, and the Colvins all had no children, and they always had a Christmas party at 4 o'clock on Christmas afternoon. And we were always invited, and there was a pattern to it, and it was a lot of fun. And I went to these Christmas parties as long as they lived, which meant that I started probably about 4 years of age and through my college years. And we would go out and we'd do charades, and there was a present for every child underneath the Christmas names on. And then before we left, Mrs. Colvin would undecorate the Christmas tree and give each one of us 2 or 3 ornaments to take home. So it was very special, and they geared it to children. And as the children grew up, we all just loved the ceremony that they did. Now, when we used to go and just visit the Colvins, Mrs. Colvin would talk about books she was reading, and she would talk about her garden, which was beautiful. And then all of a sudden, she started talking about the book she was writing. And she was writing the history, or a lot of autobiography, actually, but it is a history of women's suffrage movement also. And that's what Anne was reading from. And the book's name is Rebel in Thought. So it was very eye-opening, because she never, ever talked about her work with women's suffrage. And here the excerpts from the book. She most certainly did more than just march, going to Washington and defying her husband. And she just didn't talk about it. But I was amazed. And when I understood the horrors that she'd experienced, it was overwhelming. So that's my story of Mrs. Colvin, who was a third grandmother.
I have to add this one coincidence that I talked to Ruth about. She said she has no explanation for how this coincidence happened, but later in Sara Colvin's life, she became, she was on the Board of Education, and she established the basis for women nursing, for your degree. And so she did more than suffrage. Well, consequence, Ruth became a nurse, went to work at the University of Minnesota, and established the criteria for long-term care facilities to meet their qualifying verification. So these two, coincidence, maybe.
It really was coincidence. But it was interesting to hear about her nurse's education. She was very interested in hearing about mine, which happened at the University of Minnesota. Oh. She was wonderful.
And can we say the name of the book again, in case people want to?
A Rebel in Thought.
A Rebel in Thought.
It's obviously out of print, but I'm sure you can find one out there in this world of books. Because
I think there's 2 copies, one at the Minneapolis Public Library and maybe one at the University of Minnesota, but it's well worth reading. It's amazing.
It really is. It really is.
Yes, and so the presentation we just did, that's what Anne was saying, was some actual quotes from her. So I thought that was really cool that we had that.
Yeah.
Well, I think,
lucky.
yeah, I think now is a good time for any questions and answers. We don't have any submitted right now, but if you all want to join and ask some questions, anything about Sara that they might be able to answer, or just general questions on suffrage for both white women, and then after that, the different legislation and things that passed to allow other people to vote too. We can see if we can answer some of those questions for you all. I definitely remember learning about suffrage and things as a kid, and you're not always good at understanding timelines when you're young. So it's now that I'm older and able to know, like, wow, it hasn't been long at all that women have had the vote, and then to read those dates of 1965 and 1954 for those other things is really sobering to realize hasn't been that long since we've granted the right to everybody. So it makes it so much more special to be able to vote now, even if this year has been pretty exhausting for all of us, I think. I think we can all still enjoy the right to vote. I don't see any questions. I hope we all, right at the bottom, there's that question and answer. Otherwise, you could throw it into the chat as well. We've got a comment that says, I do love that we were and still are ladies with attitude. And another comment that says, thank you so much for your passion and enthusiasm for honoring our history and sharing that with us today. Thank you. Oh, here, we've got a question. Wonderful. Jane McGo says, what they think is their great aunt voted in South St. Paul, Anna Louise King. So that's pretty cool. DCHS is working on trying to make sure we know all the names of the women who did vote that first day. So that's really cool that we've got an attendee that knew one. Any other questions or comments from our group? Got a comment that says, it hits me when I realize women got the right to vote 2 years before my mother was born. Yeah. I think that's one of the best ways we can try to bring context into historical events, is I do that too, is I think about, okay, that year my mom was that age, or that year my grandmother was this age. I think things seem way long ago when they aren't anymore, and if we remember the people in our lives who experienced it, it really helps us realize the difference. Someone else says, my grandmother turned 21 that year, but I never thought to ask her who she voted for.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Okay, so we got another question. How has Minnesota honored the women who were part of the suffrage movement? Do you know much about the memorial, Anne, by the state capitol? You got to turn on your mic quick here. I think you're muted.
I confess I do not, although you can tell from the first picture we had in the slide presentation, it's fairly contemporary. It was only done in the last decade or something, which I was surprised at. So it's a recent phenomenon that we've recognized that suffrage movement. So, and there was one woman that was really responsible for it. Do I remember her name? No, I apologize.
Georgia.
Yeah.
Was it?
I think it was Georgia Lindeke.
Was it? Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't know much about how Minnesota has honored it, but I know this year for sure, even nationwide, at least a lot of books are coming out this year on suffrage, which is exciting. But I also was like, but I want them before, so I can read all of them before the anniversary. So if you're interested, I know a lot more books are coming out on, especially the aspect of women of color and how they participated, because it wasn't always in the same organizations as white women. that they were fighting for the right just as much, but in different ways. And I have more information if I read that book, but it's not quite out yet.
But that was a picture. I don't know whether people saw it as it is. It's a very unusual kind of metal fence with about 8 or 9 women's names. They're all being honored, but I don't think they were all suffragists, the ones that are on that fence. I don't know for sure.
Well, just from the research we've done on Sarah, I doubt that there were many besides her from Minnesota that were actually in Washington and doing what she did. Now, Clara Euland, of course, did a lot here in Minnesota, and others did too. But I guess I would have to do the research, but I would be surprised if anyone could match Sarah's activity.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll pull up that picture really quick just so we can see it. We might as well look at that again. So you can see the Capitol here. And yeah, it does look quite modern, as we were saying. There's a little spot for Sarah.
I think you could walk by that fence and really not know where it is.
That's what I was just going to say. I think I'm glad we have this picture here because I don't know if I've ever noticed it when I was at the Capitol.
I swear, for 10 years, I must have driven past it and walked past it and never seen it until I had to go over and take a picture of it. Where? Oh, it's there. Oh. So.
Now that it's all nice out, it'd be a good thing to go walk by eventually for all of us.
Yeah.
So, well, I want to just tell you a bit about what's coming up for DCHS to see if we have any more other questions or comments coming in here. The Sibley site is going to remain closed through the end of the season. We're going to continue to do online things like this every month. We have Mendota After Hours, just like this Zoom webinar. And we learn about a new topic each month. Next month, we're learning about Pike Island. And oh no, that's October. I'm getting my month switched. October is Pike Island, and September is about Fort Snelling. So I will have the information on those events on the website and Facebook this coming week. So you can look out for that. After this is done and you press end, Zoom is going to open up a survey for you to answer. It'd be great if you could, it's like 2 minutes, 2 to 5 minutes. Great if you turned that in because this is the first time we've done this little tea thing, and we'll see how it went and if you guys enjoyed it. But thanks so much for joining and registering. It helps us continue to do things like this, and it's been really fun to join online and do things since we can't join at the Sibley site. But keep a lookout. We're continuing to do fun things, even with a crazy year. So, any closing thoughts, Anne or Ruth? I don't think we've got any other more questions.
No. Very nice.
So, someone says...
I did think of something. Everybody vote. Be sure you vote.
Yes. Someone says, what a wonderful way to commemorate this important anniversary. Truly enjoyable. Thank you so much. And another thank you. So, all good things. Thanks everyone for joining. Enjoy the nice weather now that we're not melting. I'm definitely going to enjoy it. I appreciated seeing everybody here, and I hope to see you on other Zooms and at the site once we're able to do so safely. So, thanks so much. Enjoy your right to vote, and enjoy the rest of your weekend, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth.